Welcome to Grandma Has ADHD, the podcast exploring the surprising, challenging, and often overlooked world of ADHD in seniors. I'm your host, Jami Shapiro, the founder of Silver Linings Transitions and an ADHD specialist. Professionally, as a senior move manager for more than 10 years, I've worked intimately with seniors challenged with decluttering and downsizing. Personally, I am the child of two ADHD parents, and I have ADHD. ADHD isn't something that goes away with age. Grandma Has ADHD is here to educate and entertain seniors and those who love them with stories of hope, resilience, and strategies, because it's never too late to understand yourself better and find your tribe. Let's get started with today's episode. I am so excited to have Dr. Kathleen Nadeau on our podcast today. She is the author of Still Distracted After All These Years. It is the only book that I found on the intersection of seniors with ADHD. And then I had also read, Dr. Nadeau, your book, ADHD Friendly Ways to Organize Your Life. So I'm probably one of your biggest fans. And so excited that you agreed to come on the Grandma Has ADHD podcast. A little more about Dr. Nadeau is that she is a clinical psychologist and the founder and director of the largest private ADHD clinic in the U.S. She's devoted much of her career to advocating for girls and women with ADHD, trying to help them become better understood and diagnosed earlier because of the very adverse events that so often occur to females when they are not treated for ADHD. Later in her career, she has published the only book on seniors with ADHD called Still Distracted After All These Years. Today, in talking with older women with ADHD, we are bringing together two of the topics that she has written about and focused on throughout her long career. Dr. Nadeau is an older woman with ADHD herself and has witnessed ADHD up close in females in her own family. She has a passion for helping females with ADHD, and she can be found on the website thechesapeakecenter.com, and that's CHESAPEAKE center.com. It will be in the show notes, and we will also play it on the YouTube video. But I'm also very excited that she is a triple Gator, which is my alma mater. So the fact that I've got this amazing woman and a Gator, it's like you're walking on water for me these days, Dr. Nadeau. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It. Well, thank you. And it helps when you give me the Cliff Note versions. But so thank you. So anything you want to say before we get into the questions that we talked about?
Well, what I'd love to say is I love the title of your podcast, Grandma Has ADHD. It is humorous, it's easy to remember, and it says it all. And yes, lots of us grandmas have ADHD. Most of us have undiagnosed ADHD.
And that has certainly been my experience working as a senior move manager. I wanted to tell you, we really didn't get into a lot of a conversation before recording this podcast because, as I shared with Dr. Nadeau, I like to be surprised like the rest of us. But yesterday, I was working with a 90-year-old woman who had a master's and I believe had been a professor. She was one of our clients who was low income. She was living in Section 8 housing. She had had a mover who had packed everything up in her home, which was considerably larger than this very small studio that she was moving into. And they dumped it all. And basically she, for 1 month, had been living on a sofa. They had not unpacked a single box. Again, this woman is 90 years old. She had no change of clothes. She had no sheets. She had no access to toiletries. She had none of her medication. I don't know how that occurred. We as senior move managers normally will help a client through the whole process, but this was someone that found us part of a nonprofit called Safe Moves for Seniors. And as we got to know her, as we were unpacking her boxes, we see all of these craft supplies everywhere, just everywhere. And the woman was brilliant and 90 years old, and you would never have known by looking at her that she was 90. She had so much energy, but the best part was she was so thankful and so positive. And, other people who had been surviving on a couch with nothing, they wouldn't have had, and she was great. She was so humorous. We bring in a magic wand because our tagline is we make moves magical, and she loved the wand, and she just was just effervescent as you could. I mean, it was just unbelievable. But all of the unfinished craft projects, and as I tell people, I'm not a doctor, but she sure had the signs of ADHD to me.
Wow.
What are your
And
thoughts?
you have shared with me that you yourself have ADHD, as do I. And one of the things that really strikes me just in listening to you is your creativity in marketing. I think it's Grandma Has ADD has a wonderful ring to it, and Making Moves Magical has a wonderful ring to it. And I think we don't talk nearly enough about the positive side of having this kind of brain called ADHD.
Sure, I agree. Well, thank you. I do call it my superpower. But let me ask you this. Why do you think that there is now only one book written on the subject? Yours, as I'll say again.
Well, that's a very good question that I don't think has a very good answer. I tried to write a book on seniors with ADHD starting about 15 years ago, and I couldn't find a publisher. They just simply didn't believe that there would be a large enough market for it. So I finally sent in another proposal when I could send in the statistic that 10,000 Americans are turning 65 years old every day. Not only that, but the amazing statistic that by 2030, that's only 6 years from now, there will be more people in the US over the age of 65 than under the age of 18. And guess what that means? I mean, just statistically, it means that ADHD is undeniably an adult disorder that starts in childhood rather than a childhood disorder that sometimes lasts into adulthood.
Right. Well, I'm glad you convinced them to write it. And it's interesting because, as I shared with you when we spoke the first time, I discovered my own ADHD only 7 years ago when my oldest child was diagnosed. And I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, I'm answering more yeses at the time. My child is non-binary, but at the time was daughter. And, so presented, I guess, as a girl, which is more the inattentive. But I said, I'm answering more yeses for her than for me. Do I have it? And he said, do you think? And that's one of the things that I've learned is that a lot of times we are diagnosed when our children are diagnosed.
Yes.
But I just had an ADHD moment. Can you believe that? Like, that is so perfect because I knew exactly what I was going to say. And I don't have to explain it to you, right?
Do not have to explain it. And I
Yes.
can tell you, I'm sure the thought will come back to you. Absolutely. But I think you're absolutely right. There are two times when women are typically diagnosed. One is at age 39. Age 39, you might ask,
Interesting.
What's that about? That is the average age into which we enter perimenopause, which means that our estrogen levels are starting to decline. And there's not nearly enough attention being paid, especially here in the US, to the fact that women's female hormone levels hugely impact their attention and focus, but also their mood and their anxiety. And so all of the things that we associated with premenstrual syndrome impact ADHD as well. And when a woman hits 39, she might have been functioning kind of, sort of okay. And then the estrogen levels start to decline and she can't manage anymore. So when women first started going to the adult ADHD clinics, and that's when women started getting diagnosed, when we recognized adult ADHD, all these females that were never diagnosed as girls suddenly had someplace to go. They could refer themselves, and they started flooding these adult clinics in the late 90s to the point that these clinics were reporting results. We're seeing many more women than men in our clinics, which people were astonished by because they still believed mistakenly that not very many women have it. So they can self-refer, and they do self-refer when they get that double whammy of ADHD and declining hormones. And the other instance is exactly what you said. Women take their child to be diagnosed because we're getting much better at diagnosing kids. And they sit there and say, yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. So they're diagnosed
Nice. So I was able to remember, and I want to go back to that estrogen conversation as well, but I was able to remember what it was I wanted to say to you, which is I have spent, 10 years working with seniors as a senior move manager. And I actually don't do the home organization. That's done by the people on my team who are competent at organizing, but I'm the one that meets with them, sees their homes. And I've been also learning about my own ADHD for 7 years. And it didn't even occur to me that my own mother had ADHD until I went to visit her back in January. And I'm looking around, and I used to say, oh, my mom has hoarding disorder. My mom has hoarding disorder, because she has piles of stuff everywhere. And I finally realized the distinction. And I'm like, my mom has ADHD. So my mother had been seeing a therapist and had seen a psychiatrist for years for anxiety and depression. And I said to my mom, I started sending her podcasts. Mom, did anyone ever suggest to you that you had ADHD? No one ever suggested it. So here I am working with seniors myself for 7 years. I'm not making the connection. And then when I made the connection, of course, that's when the whole grandma has ADHD. And I do want to say the show is not just for women or for grandparents. I decided to name it Grandma Has ADHD because, as I shared with you in the beginning, my brother and I knew that our father had ADHD. It was, you could see it in baby videos of him just constantly moving. So it was evident. And I don't think that men are going to be as surprised, even older men, to learn that they have ADHD. But to your point, it's these women who are discovering it. And now it's interesting. We were doing this job for this client yesterday, and 4 of the 5 of us on the team have ADHD, and some diagnosed and some have a child, but they're like ding, ding, ding. And we're looking around thinking this is what's going to happen unless we start talking about it and addressing the low income and the financial decisions and holding on to things and starting projects and all of the things that we discovered. So the other comment that you talked about with estrogen, I've also heard that there isn't a single study right now on the effects of estrogen and ADHD. Is that still the case? Do you know?
Oh, no, there are many studies. There are many studies on it. And interestingly, I don't know how to explain this, but it's the awareness of the connection between estrogen and ADHD is so common in Europe and in the UK. And some European specialists have asked me, why is the US so far behind? And I don't know how to explain it, except that we got stuck long ago in thinking of ADHD as a male disorder and a childhood disorder. Mm-hmm. And we really are only very belatedly starting to look at women. And it is, I think another factor is that the leaders in the field for the past 40 or 50 years have almost entirely been male. And now women experts in ADHD are coming to the forefront. My longtime partner, Patricia Quinn, who is a physician, was beating the drum about hormones for the past 25 years and got nowhere. And we used to joke that we're talking to the wrong physicians. We're talking to psychiatrists who are ADHD specialists. We should be talking to gynecologists who know about hormones. Everybody stays in their silo here in the US and don't communicate. So that is just now beginning to change. Thank goodness.
So this wasn't one of the questions that we talked about, but what can a senior do who has gone through menopause? I'm entering the stages of it now. What does a senior do who's over the age of 60? And I don't believe we can do estrogen replacement at that point, can we?
Well, the fact of the matter is that things kind of stabilize after we get through menopause. That what is destabilizing is the fluctuation in hormone levels. And so the critical period is in perimenopause, which is a 10-year period, and sometimes longer for many women, and during the very early phases of menopause. So I am well beyond menopause and don't find, because there are no hormonal fluctuations, my estrogen levels are not declining. So that's no longer a factor. But I think there's another really important factor that we haven't talked about, and that is ageism. And I'll tell you a funny story. When I first started talking about writing this book on older adults with ADHD, I was just chatting with my husband one evening, and he made the classic statement. He said, "Why does it even matter that you have ADHD once you're older and retired?" As if people don't have anything to do once they're retired. So why does it matter that they have ADHD? And I've been on a number of podcasts and radio interviews and that sort of thing over the past year and a half since my book came out. And I'll never forget a comment that a woman who called into the radio show made, and I kept it ever since. And she said, "I need my brain." And we all need our brains. And she's saying, "I have lots that I have to track and manage as an older adult. And I really resent it that people think I've got nothing to do and I don't really need my brain anymore. I need my brain."
I love that you shared that. That's one of my personal missions prior to even this ADHD journey was we don't want to talk about aging in our society. We want to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it isn't going to happen. So we could go on a total tangent on that one, but I'm going to be so proud of myself and bring myself back. And even I will share with you, I'm 54 and I have to set reminders for myself now. Even did I take my medication this morning? So I agree. We always need our brains. And I think that people with ADHD just really have so much to contribute. And I have heard, I don't know if you've heard this, but that people with ADHD are like 10 years younger than their physical age. Am I just making that up?
Yes, that's not really accurate. What is accurate is when we are younger, our brains develop more slowly. And so there is sort of an inherent immaturity, if you will, when we're in our teens and 20s. And our prefrontal lobes really aren't fully developed until we're 30 or in our early 30s. And so you'll see a lot of young adults that are having enormous difficulties managing their daily lives when they're 20 or 25 years old that are doing much better by the time they're 30 or 32 because their brain finally fully developed, among other things. There's another thing I think that's important to think about in terms of the impact of ADHD on older adults. And I draw an analogy between what happens to us as teenagers, young adults leaving home, and what happens to us as older adults that are leaving the roles that have been in our life for decades. We're no longer actively parenting, then we retire, we're no longer actively working, we don't have a place to go every morning, a time to be there, people to interact with. And so just as teenagers and early 20s are losing the structure of home, where parents are going to remind you, parents are going to be worried if you haven't come home and it's 2:00 in the morning. Parents are going to remind you that you have a dentist's appointment. They're going to ask you if you've written your term paper yet. And then all that structure goes away. And similarly, the structure goes away when we retire. And I really worry about massive disorganization and massive social isolation hitting a lot of people when they retire. Especially, there's so many seniors that move when they retire at the urging of their children. You know, you need to be closer to us because you're going to be getting sick and we can't possibly take care of you if you're halfway across the country. But they're not taking into account that by moving, they're leaving everything familiar behind. They're leaving all their friends behind and have to build a whole new life. And so one of the things that I've written about is, I think for a lot of seniors, there's a great advantage and appeal to living in some kind of a senior community where there is structure. There are people to help you. There's company. There's somebody to eat lunch and dinner with. And so that social isolation doesn't happen.
Well, as a senior move manager, you couldn't have said anything better. I agree. I would much rather be in community with other people. Do you think, this is what I'm starting to open my eyes to ADHD. Do you think that this is something that's been going on and we just didn't see it? Do you think, I mean, I have heard that there's a rise in not the heritableness of ADHD, but just this, like the constant movement of electronics for our children, that maybe there are more kids having ADHD that might not have because of that. But with seniors, what do you think is going on? What do you think is happening with them? Is it just that we're suddenly realizing it or calling it something?
Well, I wish we were suddenly realizing it, which is why I wrote the book. I would say the vast majority of people with ADHD as seniors are not diagnosed. And if they are diagnosed because their middle-aged son or daughter recognizes, my son has ADHD, I have it, and you have it too, mom or dad. But in general, there's a fellow named David Goodman, who is one of the other few specialists in ADHD in older adults. And he did a survey of memory clinics, asking them a very simple question. Do you routinely screen for ADHD when an older adult comes to you concerned about memory problems? And only about 20% of them did screen at all, and they didn't do much of a screening. It's just not on their radar. And so I wrote a story in my book about a woman who was misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's and was put on medication for Alzheimer's because her husband thought she was so forgetful and kept misplacing things and forgetting what he told her. Well, she'd been doing that her whole life.
Yes.
But as she was older, he suddenly became concerned. He took her to an older neurologist that didn't know anything about ADHD in older adults, and he misdiagnosed her, put her on medication. When her husband passed away, her son came down to help her. And she told him, I don't think I have Alzheimer's. I've never thought I had Alzheimer's, and I want to go see a different neurologist. And her son took her to a younger female neurologist who diagnosed her with ADHD. And you'd think that would be a happy ending, but sadly, that younger female neurologist had zero training in treating older adults for ADHD. And so she said, yes, you have it, but there's nothing we can do about it, which is so wrong. We know, interestingly, of the 150 older adults that I interviewed individually for my book, well over 80% of them were taking stimulant medication, were able to tolerate it, and were really benefiting from it. And that's a word that needs to get out, because there are an awful lot of physicians that think it's too dangerous,
Right, because they're taking so many other things for other issues, and where's the balance, and just like you said, is it that important? But so let me ask you this question. So yesterday, I'm looking around. I think it's evident that this woman has ADHD. Again, I claim I'm not a doctor. Is it something that I would share? I mean, what would your advice be to me when I'm encountering that? Is it something that, how would I bring that up? Do I bring it up? Do I just keep it to myself?
That's a good question. And I think it's a judgment call. I think that there are some people that would be horrified or offended, and you don't know me from Adam, and it's none of your business, and why are you saying that? And other people that might be intrigued and might say, I sort of thought about that too, but nobody, so it really is a judgment call. And I've had many middle-aged people ask me the same question about how do I bring it up with my parent? And some parents are adamantly opposed to it, and other parents consider it and maybe even benefit from a diagnosis and treatment, but not enough yet. I mean, that's an area that we need to do a lot more public education. And before the public education, we need to do a lot more education of mental health professionals so that they're comfortable recognizing and treating it in older adults.
So how do we make this happen, Dr. Nadeau? What do we do?
Well, we make it happen in the way you're doing now and the way I'm doing now, by writing, by podcasting, by attending meetings, by communicating with the magazines that really do wonderful public education about ADHD. I don't know how many of your listeners know about Attitude magazine, but I'm a huge fan of Attitude, and they really have taken it upon themselves to be kind of the biggest public educator about ADHD at every phase of life. And they have invited me to give lectures. They've written lots of articles. So the word is getting out there, but there's still an awful lot of work to be done.
There absolutely is. And so you anticipate that we are going to see more, because as I was learning, and I think I had actually heard Dr. Goodman say that there was no testing right now for estrogen and ADHD. And you said that's not the case anymore. So maybe things are changing. I think it was Dr. Goodman.
Perhaps I'm not sure what you mean by testing for estrogen and ADHD. We can certainly measure estrogen levels, and there is research that now exists about fluctuating estrogen levels and ADHD.
Good. I think that's what it was. It was the research of fluctuating estrogen levels. So I'm glad to hear that. We discussed, Dr. Nadeau, that we felt that a half an hour was a really good amount of time for someone with ADHD to listen in on the podcast. But there's a really big thing that we definitely want to talk about. So we've asked if you would come back, and that's emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitive dysphoria and how it plays out in families. So we are going to have you come back and do a second part. But is there anything else that we need to cover today that you feel like if I don't share this, then I am going to have those ruminating thoughts going round and round if I haven't said it?
Well, what I would like to say is that ADHD is a highly treatable condition at every age, and that my clinic has run a support group for older adults that started at the beginning of COVID. So it's been going on for a long time. And the older adults in that support group have said it's the highlight of their week. It's just been magical for them to meet other older adults that share the same struggles that they do, that they felt they didn't understand, they felt ashamed of, and now they do understand. And they've also found a community of people that understand and accept them. So I think that really needs to be our movement, not just can I take medication, but can I find my tribe? Can I find support groups?
Absolutely. I went to a book club of people with the book Tracy Otsuka's ADHD for Smartass Women. And I attended her in-person book club, and the woman who hosted the book club, who does all sorts of books, said that she had never met a more lively group of people. And we got there and we all felt connected. And I never knew the reason that I didn't like small talk. We ADHDers hate boredom. So to get into a room full of strangers and be able to bare your soul. So I can't even imagine how wonderful that would be for seniors, especially those who are just like a lot of us middle-aged moms discovering that we have ADHD. So share how your clinic can support our listeners who are going to be discovering they have ADHD or have discovered they have ADHD. And so you mentioned you have the support group. Is that open to anybody, anywhere? Is it virtual?
It's virtual. It's open to anyone, anywhere. And the other thing I would say is a wonderful thing called PsyPAC has come into existence over the past few years. And that's an organization that links psychological associations in many states. Therefore, all of our psychologists that belong to PsyPAC can treat anyone in the 40 plus states that now belong to PsyPAC. It's really a handful of states that don't belong. And I say that because my clinic is in the Washington, D.C. area, but if you live in a smaller town or in a rural area, it's very, very tough to find anyone that treats adult ADHD, much less older adults with ADHD. And so we really want to serve as a hub, either trying to help people find someone that can work with them closer to home or working with us virtually if they can't find such a person.
Wonderful. Well, I think we need to get the spelling of that and put that in our show notes so people can find it.
Good. And what I want to help people remember, Chesapeake is not a word that everyone spells, but think of the Chesapeake Bay. We're in Maryland, and that's why we're called the Chesapeake Center. ChesaPeake. It's an old Indian name, and it's an old Maryland name.
Wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add today before
Oh,
we
just
close
thank
out?
you so much. And I would love to hear more about your adventures helping older adults relocate. What a wonderful mission in life.
I appreciate that. And I look forward to talking to you again, because we have quite a lot that we need to share to make people's lives, as I say, the rest of their lives, the best of their lives.
That's a great saying. Okay. Take care. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
If you are listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you or a loved one is feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of ADHD or disorganization. Since those of us with ADHD tend to struggle with where to begin big projects like moving or home organizing, the Silver Linings Transitions team can guide you through the process, breaking tasks down into manageable steps or handling every detail. There's a reason our team carries magic wands when we work with our clients. We can pack and move your entire home, and you won't have to miss a day of work or touch a single box. We also provide home organizing and storage sortouts with an understanding of ADHD. If you have a home to sell, we can provide you free or discounted services when we refer you to one of our realtor partners through our realtor referral program. Visit our website at www.silverliningstransitions.com or call us at 760-522-1624 to learn more about how we can help you make your move or home organizational project magical. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.